The chief flight attendant's voice sliced through the hushed elegance of the first-class cabin like a blade through silk. "Ma'am, I'm going to ask you one final time. Please vacate this seat and proceed to the rear of the aircraft. If you refuse to comply, I will have no choice but to contact security." Each word fell with calculated precision, wrapped in a veneer of professional courtesy but dripping with unmistakable disdain and barely concealed contempt. Zara Williams, a brilliant 28-year-old black woman and CEO of SkyBridge Airlines, remained perfectly still in her assigned seat in row 2A. She lifted her gaze slowly, meeting the flight attendant's hostile stare with eyes as calm and steady as morning mist over still water. Her voice, when it came, was soft yet unwavering, carrying the quiet strength of someone who had weathered countless storms. "As I've already explained, I'm not moving from my assigned seat." There was no anger in her tone, no defensiveness, only a profound, unshakable resolve that seemed to unsettle everyone within earshot, as if they were witnessing something they couldn't quite comprehend. Zara had just endured public humiliation in a packed cabin under the scrutinizing eyes of dozens of strangers. Yet none of these passengers could have possibly imagined that within mere minutes, this composed young woman would rise to reveal her true identity, completely upending not just this flight, but challenging the very foundations of an industry built on unspoken hierarchies. The late afternoon California sun streamed through the aircraft's thick windows, casting golden rays across the sumptuous caramel leather seats of Flight SB-847's first-class section. Every detail in this exclusive space, from the gleaming gold-plated fixtures to the soft jazz melody floating through hidden speakers, screamed luxury, privilege, and exclusivity. The passengers here knew their place in the world's pecking order: perfectly tailored designer suits, Swiss timepieces catching the light, faces accustomed to having their every whim catered to without question. This was their domain, their sanctuary above the clouds. At precisely 3:47 p.m., the cabin door whispered open. Zara Williams stepped inside with quiet grace, her movements unhurried and purposeful. She wore an impeccably tailored charcoal gray suit that spoke of understated elegance, a crisp ivory blouse, and classic black pumps that clicked softly against the polished floor. Her natural hair was styled in an elegant updo, and her only jewelry was a simple platinum wedding band that caught the afternoon light. In one hand, she carried her smartphone, in the other, a sleek leather briefcase. Her expression remained serene, her stride confident yet unassuming. Not a single passenger, not even those engrossed in animated discussions about market fluctuations and corporate mergers, realized that this poised young woman actually owned the very airline carrying them through the sky. She moved through the cabin like a gentle breeze in a stifling room, heading toward the seat clearly marked on her boarding pass. Near the front galley, Sandra Mitchell, the 44-year-old chief flight attendant, stood with military precision. Her platinum blonde hair was swept into a flawless chignon, her uniform pressed to perfection, her makeup applied with the skill of a professional artist. Her steel-gray eyes, framed by expertly applied mascara, had just finished bestowing warm, effusive greetings upon billionaire power couple Harasses and Victoria Sterling, longtime platinum-level customers of the airline. The practiced smiles, the deferential bows, the careful attention to every detail, all of it was reserved exclusively for passengers she deemed worthy of such treatment. Sandra had personally lifted Mrs. Sterling's designer handbag to the overhead compartment, fluffed her cashmere travel pillow, and poured 2 crystal flutes of Dom Perignon champagne. But the moment Zara Williams crossed the threshold into first class, Sandra's well-rehearsed hospitality evaporated like morning dew. Her calculating eyes swept over Zara's appearance, taking in her dark skin, her understated attire, her simple accessories, and lingered disapprovingly on her modest black shoes. The warm smile vanished from Sandra's face, replaced by a cold, suspicious expression that could freeze water. She deliberately stepped into Zara's path, her voice dripping with condescension and false concern. "Excuse me, miss, but I believe you may have wandered into the wrong section of the aircraft." Her words hung in the air like an Arctic wind, causing conversations throughout the cabin to pause mid-sentence. Several passengers turned their heads, some frowning with curiosity, others maintaining studied silence, all waiting to see how this apparent interloper would respond and how Sandra, clearly the authority figure here, would handle what they assumed was an obvious mistake. Outside the aircraft windows, the California sunset was beginning to fade into twilight. Inside the cabin, an undercurrent of prejudice and assumption was beginning to ripple outward like stones thrown into still water. No one, not even Sandra herself, could have imagined that within the next 90 minutes, this quietly determined woman would completely transform everything they thought they knew about power, respect, and justice at 35,000 feet. Sandra Mitchell's pointed question still echoed through the first-class cabin as Zara Williams came to a graceful stop, her composed smile never wavering for even a moment. She maintained her dignified posture and simply extended her smartphone, the bright screen clearly displaying her electronic boarding pass, Seat 2A, First Class, passenger name, Zara Williams. The confirmation number glowed prominently beneath her name. But Sandra didn't even glance at the device. Her cold, calculating eyes remained fixed on Zara's face, scanning her features with the kind of scrutiny typically reserved for suspected criminals. Her gaze seemed to say without words, "Who exactly do you think you are, and what gives you the right to be here?" Rather than following standard airline protocol, checking the boarding pass, verifying the passenger's identity, confirming seat assignments, Sandra planted herself firmly in the narrow aisle like an immovable barrier. Her voice took on a sharper edge, laced with barely concealed superiority and dripping sarcasm. "This particular section is exclusively reserved for our premium passengers and frequent flyers. If you've made an error in your booking, I'd be more than happy to escort you to the economy section where you'll be much more comfortable." Zara maintained her steady gaze and replied with quiet dignity, "I'm confident that I'm in my correct assigned seat." She wasn't defensive or argumentative, just quietly resolute, displaying the kind of inner strength that develops in people who have faced discrimination so frequently that they've learned to stand firm without becoming victims of their own anger. At that precise moment, every eye in the first-class cabin turned toward the unfolding confrontation. 3 rows back, Marcus Thompson, a 47-year-old investment banker wearing a crisp navy suit and burgundy tie, watched the scene with growing unease. Marcus had built his career on reading people and situations, and something about Sandra's behavior struck him as fundamentally wrong. He noticed that she hadn't bothered to examine Zara's boarding pass, hadn't followed any of the verification procedures he'd witnessed countless times before. Though he'd observed similar subtle discrimination in boardrooms and exclusive clubs throughout his career, he felt a knot of discomfort forming in his stomach. Yet, like so many others before him, he remained silent, unwilling to risk his own standing by intervening. Across the aisle, Isabella Hartwell adjusted her designer glasses and leaned toward her traveling companion. Her perfectly styled golden hair caught the cabin lights as she whispered just loudly enough for half the section to overhear, "Another one of those upgraded passengers, I suppose. Probably some new diversity initiative or charity program." Her voice carried the bitter entitlement of someone who believed that privilege was a birthright rather than an opportunity, and her assumption that anyone unfamiliar must be there through some form of charity revealed the depth of her prejudice. A heavy silence settled over the cabin like a suffocating blanket. Passengers exchanged meaningful glances, eyebrows raised in judgment, soft murmurs of disapproval rippling through the exclusive space. No one spoke up in Zara's defense, but everyone seemed to sense that something was deeply wrong with the situation unfolding before them. These wealthy, influential passengers didn't need words to communicate their assumptions about who belonged in their rarefied world and who didn't. Their silent consensus had protected people like Sandra for years, allowing her to wield airline policies however she saw fit, secure in the knowledge that her actions were backed by the unspoken approval of the privileged ecosystem around her. Deep in her heart, Sandra felt emboldened by this familiar dynamic. To her, maintaining the standards of first class wasn't just her job, it was her sacred duty. In a world where she was otherwise powerless among titans of industry and inherited wealth, her uniform granted her a small kingdom where she could exercise absolute authority. She genuinely believed she was protecting something valuable, something that needed to be preserved against those who didn't understand or deserve it. Sandra stepped even closer to Zara, abandoning any pretense of professional courtesy. "If you cannot produce a valid membership card or frequent flyer credentials, I'm going to have to insist that you relocate." Our premium passengers have special privileges and recognition that I'm familiar with. I know every single one of our valued customers by name and face." Zara stood her ground with remarkable composure, her smartphone still extended, her voice remaining calm and measured. "My name appears on your passenger manifest, and my boarding pass is completely valid. That should be more than sufficient verification for anyone." The atmosphere in the cabin grew increasingly tense and oppressive. Some passengers turned away, suddenly finding their magazines and newspapers fascinating. Others stared intently at their phone screens, desperate to escape the collective shame that was beginning to take shape around them. In an instant, this luxurious cabin had transformed into a silent battleground, a place where prejudice, suspicion, and complicity were forming an impenetrable wall of hostility. Sandra's lips curved into a cold, satisfied smile, the expression of someone accustomed to victory through the silence and inaction of bystanders. She had no idea that in that moment, she was sowing the seeds of a storm that no amount of privilege or institutional protection could contain. Outside the aircraft windows, darkness was slowly creeping across the sky, swallowing the last traces of sunset. Inside the cabin, prejudice had established its foothold, preparing for what would become its final stand in the skies above America. The oppressive silence in the first-class cabin hadn't even begun to lift when Sandra Mitchell took another deliberate step forward, asserting her authority at the very heart of the exclusive section. She was confident that the unspoken rules of this privileged world and the silent approval of her fellow passengers would shield her from any meaningful consequences. Her voice rang out with cold determination, as though she were simply performing her routine duties, as though her uniform alone granted her the divine right to determine who deserved to be here. "I don't see your name anywhere on our priority passenger list," Sandra declared with icy authority. "If you're not a recognized premium member, please proceed immediately to the economy section. Otherwise, I'll have no choice but to contact airport security." Her words carried the weight of someone who had never been challenged in this domain, someone who had grown comfortable wielding power without accountability. The entire cabin seemed to freeze in place. A ripple of hushed whispers spread through the section like wildfire. Many passengers looked up from their newspapers, tablets, and phones, casting quick, judgmental glances at Zara that mixed curiosity, skepticism, and barely concealed irritation. Even the slightest disruption in their perfectly curated environment felt like a personal affront to people accustomed to seamless service and absolute deference. In spaces like this, speaking up was a luxury few could afford. A single act of dissent could result in social exile from the privileged circles these passengers desperately needed to maintain their status and influence. The fear of being ostracized kept them silent, complicit in a system they might privately question but would never publicly challenge. Zara remained perfectly still, her expression unchanged. Her remarkable composure wasn't just the practiced mask of someone who had grown weary of fighting, it was the accumulated strength of someone who had faced thousands of similar battles in boardrooms, hotel lobbies, exclusive restaurants, and airplane cabins, and had emerged victorious through sheer force of character. She responded with crystal clarity, her words respectful but carrying an unmistakable undertone of warning. "I strongly suggest you double-check your passenger manifest before making any hasty judgments or decisions." Her voice carried just enough volume for everyone in the section to hear, yet it felt almost like a gentle caution, a final opportunity for Sandra to step back from the precipice she was approaching. But the warning only seemed to inflame Sandra's determination. Deep in Sandra's eyes burned the fury of someone whose absolute control was being questioned in her own territory. With years of luxury service experience behind her, Sandra knew exactly how to exploit every gray area between official policy and personal prejudice to maintain her unchallenged position in this rarefied world. Sandra's tone hardened as she leaned forward, emphasizing her role as the ultimate gatekeeper. "I know exactly who belongs in this section and who doesn't." Those words sliced through the air like a blade. It wasn't merely a refusal to check the manifest, it was a verdict delivered without trial, because in Sandra's mind, any ticket or identification could be nullified by a single glance informed by a lifetime of unconscious bias and learned prejudice. Some passengers, like Isabella Hartwell, allowed faint, satisfied smiles to cross their faces, as though they expected Zara to quietly accept defeat and retreat to where they believed she belonged. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing something fundamentally wrong but lacking the courage to intervene, choosing instead to hover on the periphery like spectators watching someone drown in a frozen river. Marcus Thompson, one of the few passengers who recognized the profound injustice unfolding before his eyes, frowned deeply but still held his tongue. He had witnessed polite decorum trampled by blind authority too many times in his career. He had also seen what happened to those brave enough to stand up. They often became targets of the same social machinery that was now grinding against Zara. He hesitated, his eyes fixed on Sandra, trying to read the real motivation behind her increasingly rigid stance. In Sandra's mind, every subtle gesture Zara made represented a threat to her carefully constructed world. To Sandra, Zara wasn't just another passenger, she was a symbol of change, a sign that the old order was crumbling, that people who had been systematically excluded might now reclaim their rightful places without asking permission or seeking approval from the traditional gatekeepers. Sandra fixed Zara with a stare that combined challenge, contempt, and a flicker of fear she didn't even realize she was feeling. "I won't repeat myself again. If you don't comply immediately, I'll contact security and have you removed from this aircraft." In that moment, the cabin seemed to crystallize into something harder than ice. All eyes were locked on the two women, one representing the desperate last stand of an old guard clinging to power at any cost, the other embodying the quiet but unstoppable force of change, small in stature but immense in dignity and resolve. Outside the aircraft, darkness had completely swallowed the runway, leaving only artificial lights and the rapid beating of hearts as witnesses to this confrontation. It was clear to everyone present that this was merely the calm before the storm, and that anyone choosing to remain silent would soon be forced to confront whether they were bystanders or accomplices to injustice. The cabin air felt thick and oppressive, charged with invisible tension that seemed ready to explode at any moment. Under the harsh white lights, Zara and Sandra stood facing each other like gladiators in an arena, surrounded by a silent crowd that preferred to linger at the edges of any conflict rather than risk their own comfort and status. Yet the longer the confrontation continued, the more flustered and unsteady Sandra Mitchell became. Zara's almost supernatural calm, neither yielding nor attacking, reflected back everything Sandra desperately wanted to deny about the absurdity of prejudice-based authority. Sandra turned her head, searching desperately for support among the familiar faces of passengers she had served for years, but this time the silent complicity that had always protected her seemed to be wavering. The atmosphere had shifted in ways she couldn't quite understand or control. In that crucial moment, Marcus Thompson, the investment banker who had been content to observe from the sidelines, spoke up unexpectedly. His deep, steady voice carried the weight of years of corporate experience and a finally awakened sense of justice. "I think it would be wise to verify the passenger manifest before proceeding any further. In your position, nothing could be worse than humiliating someone who has every right to be here." Marcus's words rang out clearly enough for everyone in the section to hear. His usual cool detachment had hardened into unmistakable sternness, like a wake-up call piercing through each person's carefully constructed defenses. Several passengers visibly shifted in their seats. Isabella Hartwell's confident smirk faltered. Younger travelers exchanged uneasy glances, and Harrison Sterling leaned toward his wife, clearly disturbed by the tension Sandra had created and allowed to escalate. Sandra bit her lip, gripping the passenger roster as though it were a lifeline in stormy seas. For the first time since takeoff, she felt the real threat of losing control, of having her authority questioned by the very people whose silent approval had always been her source of power. In a desperate bid to salvage her crumbling confidence, she blurted out a line that cut through the polished etiquette like a rusty knife. "Can't you people see what kind of person she obviously is?" The question spilled out almost by instinct, and just as quickly, Sandra realized she had exposed her true nature, the ugly undercurrent she had long hidden behind professional decorum and practiced smiles. The cabin fell into a silence so complete it felt like the world had stopped breathing. Some passengers swiveled in their seats to stare, eyes wide with shock and disbelief. Isabella Hartwell pushed her designer glasses up her nose, her expression a mixture of surprise and disgust. Several younger passengers actually gasped, covering their mouths as they sat up straighter in their seats. The silence at this point was no longer a safe choice, it had become a burden, a weight that pressed down on everyone's conscience. Every person in that cabin suddenly recognized they were standing on a fragile moral boundary. They could speak up and risk their own comfort, or remain silent and become complicit in an injustice that was now impossible to ignore or rationalize away. In the corner of the cabin, Emma Rodriguez, a young assistant flight attendant, tightened her grip on her own copy of the passenger manifest. Torn between competing loyalties, she knew that Zara Williams's name was prominently listed with special priority annotations that she had seen with her own eyes. Her lips parted as if to speak, but Sandra's withering stare pinned her into silence once again. Fear and helplessness waged war in Emma's heart, between protecting her fledgling career and following a conscience that refused to look away from obvious wrongdoing. The tension had become so charged that the slightest spark could ignite everything. Everyone in the cabin sensed the danger of allowing this injustice to become normalized, of letting prejudice win through their collective inaction. Marcus Thompson kept his eyes locked on Sandra, waiting for a response more appropriate than clumsy excuses or desperate deflection. He understood that if no one dared to light the first flame of justice, all their values would collapse in shameful silence. Sandra stood alone in the middle of a sea of people, many of whom had silently supported her just moments before but had now become her judges. In that instant, the power balance began to crack and shift, signaling the dramatic upheaval that was about to unfold. No one in that cabin knew that in the next few minutes, every small action would become evidence of right or wrong, of courage or complicity, of justice or the kind of silence that enables evil to flourish. The tension in the first-class cabin remained suffocating and oppressive after Sandra Mitchell's thinly veiled prejudice had slipped from her lips like poison. But instead of retreating or reconsidering the consequences of her actions, she dug in deeper, feeding the very power spiral she had created. As if provoked by Zara's silent challenge and unshakable dignity, Sandra shifted from passive control to deliberate, calculated acts of humiliation, the cruelest kind of power play, reserved for moments when the powerful feel their authority threatened by forces they cannot understand or control. Sandra stepped away from their confrontation, straightened her uniform with exaggerated precision, and began serving champagne and premium cocktails to each first-class passenger, all of them white or familiar VIP customers she recognized from previous flights. She was warm and attentive with each person, leaning in to ask if they needed anything special, her eyes bright with the confidence of someone who believed she was still in complete control of her domain. The cabin's surface seemed to calm, but beneath the polished veneer, the air grew even more stifling and uncomfortable. As she passed Zara's seat, Sandra deliberately ignored her existence entirely, as though she had become invisible. Other passengers, though none spoke up directly, followed Sandra's every movement with growing unease. Some looked visibly embarrassed by what they were witnessing, others appeared annoyed by the ongoing disruption, but most turned away, avoiding Zara's gaze as if they themselves were somehow at fault for the situation. This collective silence only deepened Zara's isolation in a sea of people who were unwilling or afraid to speak up for what was obviously right. Zara remained perfectly composed throughout this deliberate slight. When Sandra swept past her seat for the third time, she simply asked in a clear, polite voice, "May I please have a glass of water?" Sandra paused dramatically, glanced down at her crowded tray of beverages, and replied with icy coldness, her tone deliberately taunting, "I'll bring you something when I finish serving our priority passengers." She turned on her heel and walked away, the silver tray glinting under the cabin lights like a weapon of exclusion. Zara sat upright, refusing to look down or show any sign of discomfort or defeat. Yet every eye in the cabin was fixed on her, waiting to see if this young woman would finally lose her temper, protest loudly, or behave rudely, exactly as they expected someone they viewed as an outsider to do. The psychological pressure was immense, designed to break her composure and justify their preconceived notions. Several minutes later, Sandra returned with a small tray containing a single glass of water. Instead of gently placing it on the table as protocol clearly required, she deliberately angled the tray so that its edge struck Zara's foot with calculated force. Just enough impact to tip the glass, sending cold water splashing across Zara's cream-colored trousers, onto the polished floor, and even onto her shoes. The sharp clink of glass against the tray rang out like a gunshot in the tense cabin. A collective gasp rippled through the section. Cold water soaked into the expensive fabric of Zara's suit. Sandra immediately assumed the role of the victim, raising her voice so the entire cabin could hear her performance. "You extended your foot into the aisle and caused me to spill water everywhere. How incredibly careless and inconsiderate." Many passengers turned to stare at the commotion. Isabella Hartwell winced dramatically. Harrison Sterling peered over his copy of the Financial Times. A young businessman near the back covered his mouth in shock. For a moment, surprise flashed across the cabin as passengers tried to process what they had just witnessed. Could any experienced flight attendant really be that clumsy? But deep in their hearts, everyone recognized it as a deliberate, calculated power play, something they had all witnessed before in various forms, yet few had ever dared to call out directly. Zara met Sandra's gaze with unwavering directness. Her voice was calm and low, but it carried clearly through the cabin, shattering any illusion of accident or misunderstanding. "You did that deliberately. I simply asked to be treated with the same basic respect as every other passenger on this aircraft." The silence that followed her words was so dense it could almost be touched. No one dared speak or meet Zara's eyes directly, but in one corner of the cabin, Emma Rodriguez, still gripping her service materials, felt tears welling in her eyes as she recognized that the truth had just been laid bare for everyone to see. For the first time since this confrontation began, the polished masks of luxury and privilege began to crack, exposing a collective shame that no amount of wealth or status could hide or justify. The oppressive tension in the first-class cabin felt like a powder keg ready to explode at any moment. Yet Sandra Mitchell clung desperately to the crumbling remnants of her authority, even as it disintegrated under the weight of every accusing gaze in the section. Zara Williams dabbed at the water stains on her trousers with quiet dignity, her chin held high. Her remarkable composure wasn't merely unshaken, it seemed to shine even more brightly, holding up a mirror that reflected Sandra's helpless fury and exposed the ugliness of her actions. No harsh words escaped Zara's lips, no sudden movements betrayed anger or frustration, just a quiet, mournful calm that belonged to someone far too familiar with injustice to be broken by it. It was precisely that unshakable serenity that struck the deepest blow to Sandra's wounded pride and fragile sense of control. All of Sandra's polished manners and professional facade collapsed in a single, terrible instant. In a moment of pure rage and desperation, Sandra bent forward, her hand raised without warning, and delivered a stinging slap across Zara's face. The sharp crack of the blow shattered the cabin's veneer of luxury and civility, tearing away every pretense of decorum and revealing the raw hatred beneath. The sound reverberated off the leather walls like a gunshot, silencing every conversation, every whisper, every breath. Emma Rodriguez, standing just behind with a tray of glasses, gasped so sharply that she dropped her napkin, her hand flying to her mouth, eyes wide with absolute disbelief. Marcus Thompson leaped from his seat, his face twisted with shock and outrage, as though he had just witnessed something that should have been impossible in civilized society. Every passenger in the section, from the long-time regulars to the younger travelers, fell into stunned silence. Several people, perhaps recognizing the historical significance of what they were witnessing, hurriedly pulled out their phones with trembling fingers and began recording. Under the cabin's warm golden lights, no one could later claim they hadn't seen or heard what had just transpired. Zara did not flinch or recoil from the blow. She didn't raise a hand to her cheek or turn her head away from the pain. She simply held Sandra's gaze with ice-cold composure, her cheek blooming red where the hand had struck. There was no anger in her eyes, no tears, no cry of outrage, only a low, resonant voice that cut through the endless silence like a blade. "You have just made the biggest mistake of your entire life." Sandra's lips trembled uncontrollably, her eyes flickering with confusion and growing terror. For the first time, she realized there was no escape from what she had done. The power she had clung to so desperately lay in complete ruins beneath Zara's unwavering stare and the cabin's silent judgment. Every pair of eyes, those who had sneered, those who had enabled her through their silence, those who had looked the other way, had now become witnesses and judges of her actions. In that moment, Sandra understood with crystal clarity that everything had changed forever. No one remained on her side. There was no silent wall of complicity left to hide behind. Only the watching eyes, the recording phones, and a bone-chilling realization that true power, once stripped of its disguise, becomes the very instrument of judgment against those who abuse it. The first-class cabin was still reverberating from the shock of what had just occurred when Zara Williams, displaying remarkable composure, retrieved her smartphone and quickly typed a message into SkyBridge Airlines' internal emergency communication system. Code Red: Incident on Flight SB-847. Immediate intervention required. No explanation was necessary. Anyone at headquarters would recognize this as the highest level alert for serious breaches of passenger safety, dignity, or company ethics. She didn't raise her voice, didn't create a scene, didn't demand attention. Her control and natural authority were more evident than ever, even though no one in the cabin yet understood who she really was or what power she wielded. At that crucial moment, Marcus Thompson, the seasoned investment banker who had been quietly observing until now, rose to his feet and took a deliberate step toward Sandra. His voice rang out firm and clear, each word striking like a hammer blow against the fragile shield of her remaining authority. You just physically assaulted a passenger in front of at least 15 witnesses. Do you have any comprehension of the legal consequences of your actions? Every eye in the cabin snapped first to Marcus, then back to Sandra. For the first time, those who had been passive spectators now saw Sandra under a harsh spotlight that left no room for respect, admiration, or even sympathy for her pristine uniform and years of service. Sandra stood there panting, her throat dry, panic flickering in her eyes like a trapped animal. She searched the cabin desperately for some sign of support, only to be met with silence, disappointed head shakes, and cold stares from people who had once accepted her as the undisputed queen of first class. The social foundation that had supported her for years had crumbled beneath her feet. Desperate and cornered, Sandra glanced toward Emma Rodriguez, the young assistant flight attendant standing trembling at the back of the cabin, clutching the passenger manifest with white knuckles, her eyes filled with fear and inner turmoil. In that moment, Emma felt every spotlight in the cabin focused on her, her heart pounding like a drum. When Sandra's eyes pleaded with her, a last resort appeal based on old hierarchies and institutional loyalty, Emma found an unexpected wellspring of courage rising within her. She bit her lip, took a small but significant step forward, and spoke in a voice that trembled but rang clear as a bell. Her name is at the very top of the priority list. Zara Williams, first class, highest security clearance. Her announcement crackled through the cabin like electricity. In an instant, everyone turned fully toward Zara, their minds racing as they recalled headlines from business journals, lists of aviation's most influential leaders, interviews with America's youngest and most successful CEOs. Sandra stood frozen in place, her lips trembling, her eyes wide with genuine terror as the full magnitude of her actions began to sink in. The truth of Zara's identity rose in the cabin like smoke from a fire, impossible to ignore or deny. The atmosphere flipped completely, indifference transformed into astonishment, arrogance melted into shame, Sandra's false confidence crumbled into utter desperation. Every passenger felt the seismic shift in power dynamics. They had just witnessed not only a transfer of authority on this single flight, but a fundamental challenge to an entire system they had thought was unchangeable and permanent. At the center of it all stood Zara Williams, the woman who had been doubted, belittled, and physically assaulted, now revealed as the true master of the skies, with Sandra and everyone else in first class merely passengers on her aircraft. The tension in the first-class cabin was still crackling with electricity when Captain Robert Hayes's deep, authoritative voice came over the intercom, requesting an immediate emergency landing at Denver International Airport. Crew, initiate Level 1 security protocol immediately. We have a serious incident requiring immediate ground intervention. The aircraft shuddered slightly as the safety announcement played, but no one paid attention to the champagne glasses or the warm glow of the cabin lights. Every eye remained fixed on Zara Williams, the woman whose quiet resolve had just dismantled a decades-old power structure in a matter of minutes. Zara rose slowly from her seat, straightening her blazer with movements that seemed to underscore her unshakable authority. Her voice was calm but carried to every corner of the cabin. "Sandra Mitchell, as Chief Executive Officer and owner of SkyBridge Airlines, I hereby terminate your employment effective immediately for gross violations of professional ethics, passenger dignity, and basic human decency." For a heartbeat that felt like an eternity, the cabin froze as if time itself had stopped breathing. Sandra, who had been the undisputed authority figure on this flight just minutes before, stood paralyzed, her face drained of all color, hands trembling as she clenched them together in a futile attempt to maintain some semblance of composure. Tears welled in her eyes and began streaming down her cheeks, unable to wash away the reality of the power and career she had just lost forever. "I didn't know who you were," Sandra stammered, her voice breaking with desperation. "I was just following protocol, maintaining standards, protecting the integrity of first class." Her excuse sounded thin and pathetic even to her own ears. Zara met her gaze with unwavering firmness. "If I weren't the CEO of this airline, would you have treated me any differently? We serve human beings here regardless of their skin color, age, background, or social status. If my presence revealed your true character, then perhaps that revelation was long overdue." Those who had remained silent throughout the ordeal now found their voices. Heads nodded throughout the cabin, some passengers wiping away tears, others flushing with shame as they recognized their own complicity in what had transpired. Emma Rodriguez, the young assistant flight attendant, stood nearby with tears in her eyes but her head held high, still clutching the passenger manifest that had become evidence of the truth. Zara turned to Emma, her voice warm and carrying clearly through the cabin. "Emma Rodriguez, you demonstrated professional integrity and moral courage when everything around you was collapsing into chaos. I want to personally acknowledge your bravery and ethical standards. You will receive an official letter of commendation and a promotion from me as soon as we land." Scattered applause broke out spontaneously, then swelled into sustained, heartfelt cheering, not the polite applause of social obligation, but a genuine expression of relief and hope for a new era of justice that had truly begun to dawn. Captain Hayes stepped into the cabin, removed Sandra's staff identification badge and wings from her uniform, and announced without a trace of sympathy in his voice, "By federal aviation regulations, you are permanently barred from serving on any SkyBridge Airlines flight or any aircraft in our partner network." Sandra sank into an empty seat, tears of despair falling silently as the full weight of her actions and their consequences crashed down upon her. Zara, meanwhile, stood at the center of the cabin, composed and dignified, her eyes blazing with quiet conviction, living proof that justice cannot wait for permission and that once truth is exposed to light, it has the power to transform entire systems that believed themselves untouchable. The applause continued, this time not just for Zara, but for justice itself, for courage in the face of adversity, and for the day when the American sky witnessed a true reckoning high above the clouds. As the aircraft touched down on the runway at Denver International Airport, security personnel and federal agents were already waiting on the tarmac. Red and blue lights flashed against the evening sky, their reflections dancing across the cabin windows of the luxury aircraft. The atmosphere inside grew even more tense and oppressive as reality set in. Every whisper faded into anxious silence. The cabin door opened with a soft hiss, and two federal agents stepped aboard wearing dark navy uniforms, their silver badges glinting under the overhead lights. The senior officer swept his professional gaze across the cabin before stepping directly in front of Zara and speaking with solemn formality. "Ms. Williams, we've received reports of a serious assault aboard Flight SB-847. Would you like to file an official federal complaint?" The cabin seemed to hold its collective breath. Zara lifted her chin and looked the officer directly in the eye, her voice calm but carrying the weight of steel, speaking not just for herself, but for every person who had ever suffered such hidden injustice in silence. "Yes, I am a black woman who was physically assaulted and publicly humiliated in front of dozens of passengers on my own airline. This cannot and will not be tolerated. A wave of emotion rippled through the watching passengers. Some closed their eyes against the painful memory of what they had witnessed, while others exhaled as if releasing a burden they had been carrying. Isabella Hartwell, who had made disparaging comments about Zara earlier, looked down in obvious shame. Marcus Thompson met Zara's gaze with clear admiration and respect. Younger passengers exchanged looks of newfound understanding about the courage it takes to stand up for justice. The agent needed no further explanation. He nodded to his partner, then turned toward Sandra with professional efficiency. In an instant, Sandra Mitchell, once the proud, untouchable authority of first class, stood small and trembling, stripped of all pretense and power. Tears continued to stream down her face as she clenched her fists, desperately trying to hold on to whatever dignity remained. But it was far too late for dignity. A pair of cold steel handcuffs clicked around Sandra's wrists in front of dozens of witnesses. The officer recited her Miranda rights in a measured, official voice, each sentence severing her last hopes for escape or redemption. Sandra Mitchell, you are under arrest for assault, violation of federal aviation safety regulations, and discrimination under the Civil Rights Act. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Sandra was led away through the cabin, her steps heavy and unsteady, shoulders shaking under the harsh airport lights. As she passed each passenger, every gaze followed her progress, no one left to defend her actions, no ally willing to stand by her side. Only the stark judgment of truth and the eyes of those who had once believed themselves uninvolved but now understood their own complicity in systemic injustice. Zara remained standing, unbowed and resolute. Her brown skin seemed to glow under the cabin lights, her expression weary but filled with quiet determination. Admiration, respect, and genuine empathy swelled among the passengers like a tide. A young woman approached hesitantly and whispered, "Thank you for speaking up. Thank you for speaking for all of us who have been too afraid to use our voices." Zara smiled, her eyes shining with renewed hope and purpose. No longer viewed with suspicion or dismissed as an outsider, she had become a living symbol of change, a beacon pointing toward a future where justice needs no special invitation and truth is restored to its rightful place in society. In that transformative moment, it wasn't just Sandra Mitchell who was on trial. It was an entire system of silence, prejudice, and unchecked authority that had been laid bare under the unforgiving light of justice, 35,000 feet above the American landscape. The applause had barely faded when, just hours later, images and video footage of the incident began flooding every major social media platform across the globe. Overnight, the story transcended the boundaries of a single first-class cabin and became a national and international shockwave that reverberated through every corner of society. Clips of Zara Williams standing up to injustice, her unwavering composure under pressure, and her powerful declaration to the federal agents circulated endlessly across the internet. "I am a black woman who was physically assaulted and publicly humiliated in front of dozens of passengers on my own airline. This cannot and will not be tolerated." At her hastily arranged press conference the following morning, Zara's simple but resonant statement went viral around the world: "Respect isn't a privilege to be earned or a reward to be granted, it's a fundamental human right that belongs to every person, regardless of their background, appearance, or social status." Within hours, the hashtag #RespectIsARight was trending everywhere from Twitter and Instagram to Facebook and international news forums. National news broadcasts replayed the confrontation continuously, and reporters scrambled to uncover every detail about Zara Williams's background, achievements, and remarkable resilience in the face of systemic discrimination. Shares, comments, and reactions skyrocketed into the millions as people around the world debated justice, racial equality, and the standards of human dignity in societies that prided themselves on being civilized and progressive. The conversation wasn't limited to everyday social media users. Celebrities, politicians, artists, athletes, and thought leaders publicly voiced their support for Zara and shared their own experiences with discrimination and prejudice. Many who had suffered similar treatment found the courage to share their stories, sparking a powerful global movement demanding that society tear down the invisible barriers that existed in every sphere of life, from corporate boardrooms to luxury hotels, from exclusive restaurants to educational institutions. The public outcry forced America's largest airlines, from Delta and United to luxury carriers and international conglomerates, to issue immediate statements acknowledging the pervasive problem of bias and discrimination in their industries. These weren't empty promises or hollow public relations gestures. Major carriers launched comprehensive overhauls of their hiring practices, training programs, performance evaluations, and customer service policies. Under Zara's visionary leadership, SkyBridge Airlines pioneered a groundbreaking reform package that became the gold standard for the entire industry. In a live-streamed press conference watched by millions, Zara stood before dozens of cameras, her tone calm yet absolutely resolute. No person, whether passenger or employee, will ever again face discrimination on our aircraft for any reason whatsoever. We are building a people-first culture rooted in respect, dignity, and equality, and we will transparently investigate and address every single violation. Immediately following her announcement, SkyBridge rolled out mandatory retraining for every crew member, ground staff member, and customer service representative in their network. Leading experts in social psychology, human rights, and anti-bias education were enlisted to design immersive, hands-on curricula that went far beyond theoretical discussions to address real-world scenarios and unconscious prejudices. All employees now undergo regular evaluations of their conduct, cultural awareness, and ability to recognize and address subtle discriminatory behaviors before they escalate. The centerpiece of this comprehensive overhaul is the 24/7 Dignity Hotline, an anonymous and public reporting system accessible to anyone, whether passenger or staff member, to report acts of bias, discrimination, or unprofessional conduct. Every report is handled with complete transparency, overseen directly by the executive board, and personally reviewed by Zara Williams herself. Anyone found in violation of the company's dignity standards faces immediate suspension and potential termination. There are no gray areas, no special exemptions, and no tolerance for any form of discriminatory behavior. Within weeks, competing airlines followed suit, upgrading their own internal processes and ushering in a genuine revolution in service standards across the industry, one where the right to respect and dignity became a fundamental principle rather than a privilege reserved for the wealthy and well-connected. Online testimonials poured in from around the world. I used to feel invisible and unworthy when I traveled. Thank you, Zara, for showing me that one person's courage can change everything. A bystander's silence can be more harmful than outright cruelty. This story reminds all of us to stand up for what's right, even when it's uncomfortable or inconvenient. From a single airplane cabin, Zara's story soared beyond national borders, awakening consciences, transforming industries, and inspiring millions of people to believe that fairness and justice are not special privileges for the few, but undeniable rights that belong to all human beings. After months of intense public debate, sweeping reforms, and unprecedented industry-wide commitments to change, Zara Williams boarded a SkyBridge flight with a surprising sense of peace and belonging. She wasn't bracing herself against potential prejudice or preparing for another battle, she was simply returning to her rightful place in the sky, in a world that had finally begun to recognize her full humanity. The cabin retained its elegance and sophistication, yet it carried an entirely new spirit of inclusivity and respect. At the entrance to first class, Maria Santos, the new chief flight attendant, a 38-year-old Latina woman with extensive experience at major international airlines, greeted Zara with a warm, genuine smile and unmistakable respect. Gone were the judgmental glances and subtle scrutiny that had once been commonplace. Maria simply inclined her head gracefully and said, "Welcome aboard, Ms. Williams. It is truly our honor to serve you today. Thank you for everything you've done to make our industry better for everyone." Every detail of the service reflected a renewed professional ethos built on fairness and dignity. The crew adhered strictly to equitable service standards, with no room for favoritism based on appearance, perceived status, or personal biases. A relaxed, genuinely friendly atmosphere permeated the cabin, allowing everyone, from business travelers to families with young children, to feel that respect and courtesy were their default rights, not privileges they had to earn or prove they deserved. In the row ahead, a 10-year-old black girl sat beside her mother, her eyes bright with wonder as she took in the view from the window. When she shyly asked for another glass of apple juice, Maria appeared promptly with the drink, accompanied by a small package of cookies and a respectful smile. "This is for our future pilots and leaders," she said warmly. The simple gesture brought a moment of profound silence to the entire first-class section. Passengers who had witnessed the earlier incident, Isabella Hartwell, the Sterlings, and even those who were new to this transformed environment, turned to Zara with expressions of genuine admiration and gratitude, as if they were in the presence of someone who had fundamentally changed their understanding of leadership, courage, and human dignity. Marcus Thompson, the investment banker who had defended Zara during the confrontation, approached her seat and extended a friendly hand. "Ms. Williams, I used to think luxury travel was about exclusivity, status symbols, and creating divisions between people. But you've helped me understand what true class really means. Thank you for that gift." Zara accepted his handshake with genuine warmth, her eyes reflecting deep gratitude. She didn't need praise or recognition, simply knowing that her actions had sparked meaningful change in countless lives was more than enough reward. As the aircraft lifted off into the brilliant morning sky, there were no longer invisible barriers or unspoken hierarchies dividing those deemed worthy from supposed outsiders. Only professionalism, mutual respect, and fundamental human values stood paramount above material luxury or social status. Bathed in the soft golden light filtering through the cabin windows, Zara Williams reflected quietly to herself, "True leadership isn't about wielding power over others, it's about accepting the responsibility to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult or costly." The greatest changes in history have always begun with someone refusing to accept that human dignity is negotiable. A new era had truly dawned in the skies, not only for Zara, but for everyone who had ever been denied equality simply for being different, for daring to exist in spaces where they weren't expected or welcomed. The transformation didn't remain confined to airport corridors or first-class cabins. As the shockwaves of the "respect is a right" movement continued to ripple through society, Zara Williams understood that genuine reform had to address the root causes of discrimination, the attitudes and systems that people had long tried to ignore or rationalize away. In the first week following the global outcry, Zara convened every member of SkyBridge Airlines' leadership team at their Chicago headquarters. The sunlit boardroom on the top floor was bright and welcoming, but the atmosphere was heavy with the gravity of the moment. Gone were the lengthy speeches and empty corporate rhetoric that had characterized previous meetings. Zara cut straight to the heart of the matter, her steady gaze scanning the room, her voice calm yet commanding absolute attention. "We will no longer simply react to incidents of discrimination after they occur," she declared. "We must prevent them, address their underlying causes, and proactively transform our culture from the ground up, starting with every single person in this room." She then unveiled a comprehensive, detailed reform plan that would become a model for organizations worldwide. First, an intensive 8-week ethics and cultural competency training program, mandatory for all flight crews, ground staff, customer service representatives, and management personnel at every level. This wasn't a superficial workshop or checkbox exercise. The curriculum delved deep into recognizing and overcoming unconscious bias, developing genuine empathy and active listening skills, understanding the responsible use of authority, and learning to treat every customer with dignity and respect regardless of their background, appearance, or perceived social status. Second, the upgraded 24/7 Dignity Hotline evolved into a comprehensive reporting platform with an intuitive interface that allowed anyone, employee or passenger, to file anonymous or public complaints about discrimination, unfair treatment, abuse of power, or violations of human dignity. All reports were directed to an independent oversight board and prioritized immediately after any safety-related incidents. There would be no bureaucratic red tape, no buried complaints, and no tolerance for retaliation against those who spoke up. Third, a zero-tolerance disciplinary policy. Anyone confirmed to have engaged in discriminatory behavior or violated passenger dignity would face immediate termination and permanent exclusion from employment anywhere in the SkyBridge network or its partner airlines. These decisions would be made public, with no exceptions based on rank, tenure, or personal connections. The culture of looking the other way and protecting problematic employees was ending permanently. Fourth, Complete transparency in personnel processes, hiring statistics, promotion data, performance review outcomes, and ethics compliance metrics would be published in real time, creating a public accountability scorecard alongside traditional business performance indicators. Regional directors, department heads, and even the most senior managers would be evaluated not just on financial results, but on their commitment to creating an inclusive, respectful workplace culture. Zara made eye contact with each leader in the room and declared with unwavering conviction, "No one in this organization can claim ignorance anymore. We cannot call ourselves a world-class airline if even a single action by our employees damages a passenger's or colleague's sense of worth and dignity." The silence that followed wasn't resistance or defiance, it was the sound of awakening. Every gaze in the room was fixed on Zara, the young leader who had transformed a personal ordeal into an industry-wide call for justice, proving that true accountability, moral courage, and transparency were the only acceptable path forward. A new era had begun where every SkyBridge employee understood that human dignity was non-negotiable, and that respect truly was a fundamental right, not a privilege to be granted or withheld based on personal prejudices. The comprehensive transformation at SkyBridge Airlines quickly became the subject of intense media coverage and industry analysis. But Zara Williams never saw herself as a hero or savior. To her, what she had done was simply the minimum response that any decent human being should choose when confronted with injustice, regardless of whether they held the title of CEO or were simply an ordinary passenger on a flight. In the weeks following that pivotal moment of justice, Zara's office and personal email were flooded with letters, messages, and testimonials from every corner of the country and around the world. They came from school children who had been bullied because of their race or background, young flight attendants who had been silenced by demanding VIP passengers, female entrepreneurs whose competence had been questioned simply because of their gender, and single mothers who had been publicly humiliated in stores, restaurants, and other public spaces. Parents of color wrote to express their joy at finally feeling safe to take their children into first-class lounges and premium spaces without fear of judgment or discrimination. One college student sent a heartfelt message, "I never dared to dream of becoming a commercial pilot until I heard your story and realized that the sky truly belongs to all of us." Zara's story had spread far beyond the aviation industry and a single first-class cabin. It had sparked a chain reaction of courage, transparency, and human dignity that encouraged people everywhere to speak up and take action, even in small ways, to defend their own rights and those of others in places where no one seemed willing to listen or care. Zara later appeared on a nationally televised civil rights roundtable alongside veteran journalists, social activists, and representatives from other major airlines. She didn't adopt an air of superiority or self-importance, only the calm composure and genuine conviction that had carried her through the original confrontation. When asked what had motivated her to risk everything by standing up to discrimination, she answered without hesitation, "If I weren't the CEO of this airline, I would have been silenced, dismissed, and forgotten, just like millions of other people are every single day. We must find the courage to speak up even when we don't have fame, wealth, or institutional power behind us. Because if we only defend justice when it's convenient or safe, then it's not really justice at all." That statement became a viral headline overnight, quoted on university campuses, in corporate training sessions, and even displayed on posters at sporting events and community gatherings. Many teachers posted it prominently in their classrooms as a daily reminder, justice exists only when everyone has the courage to speak up, no need to wait for power or permission. In the main lobby of SkyBridge Airlines' new headquarters hangs a large photograph that every employee, client, and visitor passes by daily. It captures Zara Williams and Emma Rodriguez, the young assistant flight attendant who refused to remain silent, standing side by side in that fateful cabin where everything changed. Below the image, etched on a polished bronze plaque, are the words, "For those with the power to choose justice, and those with the conscience to demand change." That photograph and message have become more than just an airline statement of values, they serve as a daily reminder of courage and moral responsibility for every person who sees them. The image represents the truth that real, lasting change always begins with individuals who refuse to wait for someone else to grant them permission to do what's right. Like falling dominoes, the impact spread to businesses, schools, hospitals, and non-profit organizations across the country and around the world. All established comprehensive reporting systems for discrimination and bias, launched extensive training programs on fairness and human dignity, and created cultures where speaking up for justice became not just acceptable, but expected and celebrated. Zara consistently refuses to accept the label of hero. But by choosing to speak up when everyone else remains silent, by refusing to accept injustice as normal or inevitable, she ignited a spark of transformation that extended far beyond one airline to inspire an entire generation of people brave enough to redefine what courage, justice, and respect mean in their daily lives. After all the storms had passed and the dust had settled, Chicago's bustling airport corridors hummed with their usual energy in the soft morning light. Yet among the sea of tailored business suits and designer luggage, Zara Williams walked quietly toward her office, her steps no longer burdened by suspicion, second-guessing, or the weight of others' prejudices, but by the profound responsibility that comes with hard-won wisdom and the courage to use it for good. On her final flight of that transformative week, as a spectacular sunset painted the sky in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, Zara paused in her seat and composed a message to her younger sister back home, the girl who had once cried after being taunted at school and asked through her tears, "Aren't you ever afraid to stand up when you're all alone?" Zara smiled softly as she typed her response, "You don't have to raise your voice or make a scene to prove your worth to anyone. But if someone tries to deny your dignity or treat you as less than human, stand up with quiet strength, and you'll discover that the whole world is listening and ready to stand with you." That message was more than private encouragement for her sister, it became the guiding principle and lasting legacy Zara wanted to leave for the next generation. A reminder that a person's true value isn't determined by their rank, race, wealth, or anyone else's limited judgment, but by their unwavering commitment to protecting human dignity in the face of injustice, no matter how small or large the stage. She had become living proof that without screaming, seeking revenge, or resorting to violence, one person could shake an seemingly untouchable system through intelligence, moral courage, and simple human decency applied with unwavering consistency. Zara Williams's story no longer lived only in the luxurious confines of a first-class cabin or the executive boardrooms of a major airline. It had blossomed into global inspiration for young women facing discrimination, students being bullied, workers enduring unfair treatment, and emerging leaders wrestling with questions of right and wrong. Each found in her example the motivation they needed to understand a fundamental truth: you don't have to be famous, wealthy, or powerful to make a difference, you just cannot remain silent when confronted with obvious injustice. In conference rooms, classrooms, and corporate headquarters around the world, Zara's story is now cited as a powerful symbol of transformation. A young black woman who was once underestimated and dismissed, who refused to bow to prejudice, who dared to stand up for herself and others, and in doing so didn't just change her own circumstances, but transformed an entire industry through the power of intelligence, bravery, and compassion applied with strategic precision. International airlines now feature SkyBridge's policies and Zara's photograph in their mandatory training programs. In SkyBridge's headquarters, the image of Zara standing beside Emma Rodriguez, the young flight attendant who refused to look away when it mattered most, hangs prominently in the main lobby like a living manifesto, for those with the power to choose justice, and those with the conscience to demand change. Since that pivotal moment, no one in the service industry dares to ignore the voice of those who are different or marginalized. New stories emerge regularly, young flight attendants defending vulnerable passengers, customers demanding fair treatment for others, managers standing up to discriminatory policies. Each incident serves as a reminder that a new standard has been established: justice is no longer a privilege reserved for the wealthy and well-connected, but a basic human right that belongs to everyone. Though Zara continues to avoid the spotlight of celebrity and media attention, her message ripples outward through the actions of millions of people every day. The lesson is simple but profound: when just one person finds the courage to stand up against injustice, they create space for countless others to find their own voices and strength. This story doesn't end with a Hollywood-style happy ending filled with dramatic music and perfect resolutions. Instead, it concludes with a quiet but steadfast reminder that resonates long after the final words: when you refuse to remain silent in the face of obvious wrongdoing, you don't just save yourself, you kindle hope and courage for an entire generation of people who are watching, learning, and gathering the strength to stand up for what's right in their own lives. If this story has touched your heart or opened your eyes to the power of individual courage, please share it with anyone who needs inspiration to find their own voice. Because sometimes, all it takes is one brave person standing up for what's right to make the whole world listen, and to prove that respect truly is a fundamental right, not a privilege to be earned.